Welcome to NarrowDoor Church. My name is Sean Emery, and this is number 4 in our teaching series on the church. And let's start off with a quote. A writer named Frank Viola said, "No matter how good Sunday is, Monday comes to test your worship." This teaching today is one that you may find yourself getting defensive with. And if you do, I have been there. So know that. Hear me say this is very important. I've been there first, all right? So if you feel defensive, I also felt defensive. If I'm wise at all, it's because I was dumb about those things first. I've been stupid most of my life. If you think I'm smart, you're just getting kind of the results of my stupidity. So I get that a lot. But the purpose of today's teaching is not do this, don't do this. And this is also important because it's going to feel like I'm saying everything's wrong, everybody's doing it wrong. You don't even know what you're talking about. It's not what I'm saying. It's not don't do this, do it this way. It's about making sure we have the right definitions so that we can have the clearest perspective. And that's sort of the goal with every teaching that we do here, that it's not so much a laundry list of like do's and don'ts, but it's more about adjustments, making those adjustments of our perception or how we perceive or just our perspective on the Bible, on God, on ourselves. And so, as I said last Sunday, God does not tolerate anything other than authentic worship. I mentioned that at the end of last Sunday's teaching, and that's why today's teaching is about the next element of the church or the service, which is worship. So first, let's set up the foundation. Let's get some background context with two passages from the Bible. We're going to go in Leviticus first, Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. And I'm going to hit the highlights because these are both huge passages, and we could go into them for numerous teachings and sessions and studies. But for today, I just want to cover a fraction of the details, which is always hard for me. So let's do it. Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. Now, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord has said. Among those who are near me I will be sanctified, and before all the people I will be glorified." And Aaron held his peace. This is a major passage, and again, it would be naive to think that we could cover it completely in one sitting. So to keep it simple, let's just look at some key details. Nadab and Abihu were sons of Aaron. They were in the priesthood. They were respected. This is a key detail. They weren't just strangers. They weren't randos. And they also weren't bad guys. They weren't like hyper sinful dudes. They were priests. They were respected. This was everybody would have known them. I mean, you had to have, stature. You had to be a pretty honorable person in order to fulfill this role. So let's get that squared away. Second detail, they took part in an act of worship. So that's what's happening here in this passage. They were taking part. They were lighting the censers with fire to take part in an act of worship, except it says the way they did it was unauthorized. And this is this is the hinge of this passage. The way they did it was unauthorized, and they were consumed by the fire of God as a result. There were consequences for that. And the last detail is that at the end, after Nadab and Abihu die, because of this strange situation, Moses goes to Aaron and he tells him God will be glorified, God will be sanctified, and Aaron is not permitted to mourn his sons. So, this is a scary passage, and it's an odd passage, and many people want to believe that this is just the old God, and he's much nicer now. You and I get older, we change, but God doesn't. The same God back then is the same God who shows up at the end, and it's my job to help you recognize him. And so let's keep this passage in mind, but let's look at one more, and then we're going to fit them together a little bit. This next one is in Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 6. And you've heard this one before. Very famous passage. Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 6. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So just two key points before two more things to put on the table before we actually organize it all. The people of Israel have been in Egyptian culture, and so they feel this passion to worship this God Moses has shown them. They ask Aaron to help them worship, to help them do that. Now, this passage is happening before the one we just read in Leviticus, so this is pre-Aaron's sons dying. Just keep that in mind. The second detail is they give valuable gold, so they give gold to create a golden calf. And Aaron builds an altar and leads this worship service. They woke up early, they made sacrifices, they made offerings, they had fellowship and celebration. So this really wasn't that crazy. As a matter of fact, if you could almost compare it to how we do things today. They fellowshiped, they hung out, they had food, they made peace offerings, burnt offerings, they sacrificed. It was a worship service. So we know that the passage goes on to say that Moses comes down from the mountain that he was meeting with God to get the Ten Commandments, right? And he sees this, and he throws the Ten Commandments down. He loses his cool completely. Moses grinds the golden calf into powder. He mixes it with the water. He makes them drink it. Moses was not to be trifled with, apparently. Why was he overreacting? Because that's what you sort of think when you read this. You're like, wow, dude, chill, right? Like, why was he overreacting? And I've heard many people, I personally have heard many people use this passage to talk about how Israel, they were just rescued by God, and they go straight back to worshiping their false gods and other religions. That's not what was happening. That's actually not true at all. That's complete misunderstanding of the text. Let's look a little deeper. I don't want to give the surprise just yet. But let's break this down. The people of Israel, they were emotional. I mean, they just crossed the Red Sea. They just witnessed this staggering miracle. They've just been rescued out of Egypt. They have followed this guy named Moses, who used to be royalty, into the wilderness. This is a traumatic scenario. It's miraculous. It's a positive thing, right? So they're emotional. They feel the urge to worship this God who rescued them. So rather than wait for Moses, whom went to meet with this God regarding the next steps, they figured they would just do what they felt instead. They would just act on their emotions. And so here's the plot twist. Okay, so Aaron dedicates this entire worship service to the Lord. If you go back and read it, he says that, and Lord is all caps, and we'll talk about that again. But you should know what all caps means, right? They were worshiping the right God, Yahweh. That's what all caps means. It was God. They were worshiping the right God in the wrong way. This is something that one of my favorite pastors loves to say, and I think it's so brilliant. It can't be said any better than that. They were worshiping the right God in the wrong way. That's John MacArthur for you. God is not like the gods of Egypt. He is not. He is nothing like they've ever seen before, and he will be regarded as holy. That is the simple point of all of this. This is the same thing that happens to Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron. They were worshiping God the way they felt, instead of the way God had asked. And this is key. That's why God tells Moses right afterwards, I will be treated better than that. You will regard me as holy, not as good, not just as pure or righteous or any of these other things. You will regard me as holy. So I came up with a way to put this in perspective, like put this in even more tangible perspective for you and I, okay? I have stood on top of mountains in Hawaii, overlooking the miracle of nature. Okay, I can picture it. I have stood there on top of this mountain. I'm looking at the Pacific Ocean all around me, untouched jungle and wilderness, utterly beautiful. The sun is bouncing off of the ocean. It's insane. And right there at the top of the peak is a bag of potato chips and some cigarettes. How despicable to see something so beautiful and not have enough regard or respect to treat it as beautiful. How despicable to see something so beautiful and then make it ugly. If it's so unimportant, you should have stayed home and watched TV. Likewise, if God is so unimportant to regard him as holy, then you should find another God to vandalize. It's the same. So, what is worship? What is worship? What does that even mean? What does it mean to worship? If worship is so serious and it is so important to get right that people have died for doing it wrong, what is it? So, I have come up with a simple, very, very simple, because it's hard, because I want to use all the big words and go crazy and go deep, but one sentence, right? What is worship? Worship is to regard something as holy. So we're doing a biblical understanding of these words and meanings. Worship is to regard something as holy. So how holy is God? Isaiah, the book of Isaiah is one of the major prophets of God. He has a vision of God and he describes it. He sees God's glory and he describes these three angels with three sets of wings that they cover their head, they cover their body, their feet, and they're flying and then they're shouting, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the Lord God Almighty. And in Hebrew, Isaiah is describing this vision. In Hebrew, when you want to emphasize something, you repeat it. So 3 times is as important as it gets. Holy, holy, holy. That's all caps, bold font with exclamation marks. So a famous preacher once pointed out, again, it's hard not to use these ideas because they're so good and they're so clear. But a famous preacher, I think this is John Piper that I heard this from, but he pointed out the fact that angels are perfectly, divinely created beings. Okay, if angels are perfect, that God created them perfect and divine, how holy is God? Even the perfect angels have to cover themselves from his glory. So, a lot holy. Very much holy. So, hearing all this, do you worship God the way you feel like it or the way he's asked? Worship is a lot more than we think, and it's a lot more strict. Worship is emotional and creative, but it is also intellectual and conscious. Exploring the gospel of God's word is the frontier of worship. Last Sunday, I mentioned the incident of people using prayer as a transition or an intermission commercial break at an event that I was speaking at. And there have been many Sunday mornings where I've just stood up and walked out. I've cried in a lot of parking lots. And you might think that sounds dramatic, but here's the thing. The Bible right? We just saw how serious the Bible treats worship, treats God, treats the things of God, who he is, that he will be regarded as holy. Just hear me out. I will forget to pray some days, or I'll get mad at someone. I'll think really negative thoughts about them. I get angry, I get impatient. And regardless of what it is, I'll feel sick to my stomach because after a moment, I'll realize that God is right there. He's right there. And he's so good and so holy, and I'm so not. I'm cruel and vindictive and impatient and ungraceful. And I can think such evil things. I'm not good enough to even worship God. I need help even with that. That's how I'll feel. I can't, this is the point. I can't worship God the way that I feel because I'm too sinful, and even my best isn't holy enough for a God this good. We need a larger perspective of God. Okay, so this is the time where we actually talk about what to do with all this and how to organize it, and then more specifically, how we how we apply it in our current context, what we're used to and what we know about church and the world and our time and our lifetimes, right? So first, let's talk about sort of the main thing that most people think about when they think about worship. Worship is often simplified to music. And this is the part where I said that your defenses may get up and you might, you might get offended at this, so just hang in there, all right? I'm going to take a deep breath, I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to explain it. Music is not worship. Music is an artistic expression, just like painting, drawing, writing, any of those things. And this is very important for us, the church, to understand. Worship, as we've just discussed, as we've just seen in the Bible, is regarding something as holy. That's what God says about himself. He says, I will be regarded as holy after somebody worships him incorrectly. So, we know this. This could not be more clear. And this is from God himself. Worship is regarding something as holy, and holy means perfectly unique, without comparison or contrast. So, how can you regard God as holy? Well, you can do that by knowing him. But then there's a problem. How can you know him if he's totally unique, if there's nothing to compare him or contrast him to? How can you know more about him? Well, he spoke about himself in his word, the Bible. And you see how all this fits together. Okay, so I'm going to fit this together right now in one sentence. So pay attention. Very clear. To worship God is to regard him as holy by knowing him, by his word, increasingly all the days of your life. Write that down, tattoo it on your arm, like me. Put it on your forehead backwards so that you can read it in the mirror when you wake up in the morning, whatever you want to do. That is what we have to understand worship as, not as singing songs. That is too simplistic. I've heard many people talk about how worship music makes them feel, and this is just one of the problems with seeing worship as musical, and this is one of those, right? I've heard many people talk about how, well, worship, it's too good, or it's too loud, or the band's not that great, or the light, I don't like the light. It feels like a rock. I've heard both sides. I've heard people that are big worship, fans, and it's so good, but they have a high standard of the music. But then I've heard the other perspective of people who just kind of want to, this is actually probably where I'm closer to, but it's let's just get to the point. I don't like to sing. This isn't fun. This isn't great. Come on. I don't know the words of this song. I sound like a donkey, squeaking, whatever your excuse is. And here's the problem with all that. Here's the problem with all of that, okay? Because I've been guilted by many of these things, and I've seen other people guilt other people because they're not singing, or it's just a mess. And all of it is misdirection. All of it's misdirection because music is not worship. It can be. It's an artistic expression, but that's not all there is to it. You are not the audience of worship. God is the audience of worship. You and I are actually the performers. And so it doesn't really make sense how worship makes us feel. It's not our job for us to feel great about it. You know, our job is to do it. Our job is what we're elevating God. We're regarding Him as holy. So to talk about how, oh, I don't like the worship here at this church, or the worship at this church is really great, man. I'm not sure that we have the correct understanding, and that's why it's so important. It's so important to talk about this stuff. Music is just expressing what you know about God. And yet, how many songs, there's been plenty of times where I've actually walked out of the service because the song being sung doesn't describe God. It talks about a golden calf, but it's not the same guy that the Bible's talking about. It's not the same one the Bible talks about. It's not regarding Him as holy. It's comparing Him with us, or it's contrasting Him with our understanding. And there's songs that are on the top 20 of Christian worship music. I went and I looked at the lyrics. They don't even mention God. They don't even mention Jesus at all. Let me put this into deeper perspective. This is hard because I know that I'm crushing people right now. I'm doing it because it's important. It's important. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that we need a bigger perspective of worship. God does not recklessly love you. He wasn't thinking about you above all. Jesus didn't come to earth because He didn't want heaven without you. All of these are popular worship song lyrics. These are huge songs written by people who are expressing things about God that are not true. They're not in the Bible. It's the golden calf versus God. We're worshiping God, but it's worshiping God the way that you feel rather than the way He's asked. And God told us, and He told Moses, and He told Aaron, and He told His people, and He told Amos, and He told the prophets, and He told everybody throughout the Bible, throughout history, I will be regarded as holy. I'm better than that your best is not good enough, that we are so sinful, we even need help with worship. We can't even repent. We can't even pray all the time. We don't even know how to... We are so helpless. We're such sinners. And God is so good and so perfect and so holy. Why would we trust our own feelings and emotions when God has so clearly asked us and directed us to do what He wants? And it's better. And it's better. Wrote a whole book called Psalms. When's the last time you heard a psalm sung at church? You hear Bethel and Hillsong and Elevation Music and a whole bunch of other CCM artists, which I've heard Beyonce. I've heard Beyonce on Sunday. Not making this up. I've heard it on Sunday morning at a church. Worship is not just praising God. It is not just praising God, but it is honoring God. And this is the key distinction. It's not just praise, but it's honor. It's honoring. There's a difference there. There's a huge difference. We honor God with our emotions, but we equally honor Him with our intellect. That we learn about Him, we think about Him, we take His words and His wisdom and we weigh them in our minds. We strive to know Him deeper. And this is what I'll end with, because I like to say this often, but this felt like the most fitting thing to say. The simplest way to wrap it up, that if it's really an issue of how we feel versus what God has asked, Jesus gives you a new heart. But he didn't forget to give you a brain too. Let's use it, especially when it comes to worshiping God. The most important, the purpose of all life, the reason that you and I are here. Let's have our hearts. Let's feel. Let's be happy. Let's rejoice. Let's sing. Let's praise him and elevate and exalt him. But not at the cost of theology, knowing who he is, knowing him deeper, having a relationship with him, intellectually thinking about him, weighing what he has said about himself. I will see you all next Sunday. This series is going to go even deeper. We're going to cover all aspects of the church, but make sure that you tune in. Make sure that if you are not joining one of our home groups, we have 2 that meet at 10 a.m. and then 1 at 11:30 a.m. in Mason, Ohio, and then Coleraine. But the online sessions like this will continue, and so if you're not able to make it to a home group, hang out with us, because this is still congregating. This is still congregating with us. And again, I'm also one of those ministers and missionaries where you can just message. You can just send me an email. The website has all that. Go check it out. Go see kind of the resources that we have there for you. And if you are able, try to make it out to one of our home groups, because we would like to see you. And that's where we actually get even deeper and we discuss and we talk. So I will see you all next Sunday. Have a good week.